Welcome to Project Hardway. I'm holding this small block Ford timing chain because I have to fix a coolant leak. Makes sense? Alright, long story short, we got a coolant leak. Short story long, picked up the truck, took it to my friend Steve's house. He comes out to check it out. He says, I smell coolant. And I said, nah. A couple of weeks later, I took it out for a drive. I brought it back and I'm like, I smell coolant. And then I get out and I look and the truck's just pouring coolant somewhere in here, right? So then I started it up, let it run, start taking a look around, and this is what I see. I'm not okay with that. Now I'm not sure where that's coming from, but somewhere up here, it looks like that fountain that my cats drink out of. Except it's on top of my engine, and it's green. Get in here, let me show you. So it's hard to tell, and I wasn't gonna stick the camera down here with this thing, you know, doing its job. But down here, it goes rapidly. Now that looks like a fairly new water pump. And none of the hoses seem to be burst. The hoses are all dry. Everything looks good with that. I think the water pump gasket might be bad. So to get in there, I'm going to have to take off all this over here. I'll start with that belt tensioner, I guess. Maybe? I don't know. All right, a 5/8 socket on the pulley for the tensioner and some leverage this way. Get the belt off. All right, before I start pulling stuff apart, I changed my mind. All right, because the belt tensioner and the alternator and alternator bracket don't actually keep you from getting the water pump off. I wanted to get that stuff out of the way so that I could maybe see where the leak is before I really tear into it. But, nah. Okay, so what I think I'm going to do instead is just take this hose off, the upper radiator hose, get that out of my way so I can get a better line of sight on where it's actually spitting water out. Look, it's my first small block Ford. I don't know. I'm learning as I go. Wow, nothing came out of there. That's because it already, you know, dumped it out everywhere else. All right, I'm not liking the look of this. It's kind of hard to see down here, but the water pump attaches to the timing cover, which then attaches to the engine block. So the coolant goes through the water pump, through the timing cover, into the engine block, which means there's a gasket here for the pump and a gasket there for the timing cover. I am afraid that we may be taking the timing cover off. All right, let's just dig in. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this pump off. Let's start by yoinking this fan off of here. 4 7/16 bolts hold that on. You see it spins freely. Now that might not spin so freely if I left the belt on it, but they make a tool to hold this. It's your other hand, maybe. Wow, them bad boys is on there. Well, when your hand doesn't work, you can put another 7/16 wrench on one of the bolts you're not trying to loosen. The only problem with that is that now you're tightening that bolt even more. See how I can cook this up. And now I got to get that one that I was using for leverage off, which means I'll probably end up tightening one of the ones I just loosened. Does that make sense? Sure. New course of action, I'm going to jam this long punch in between the bolt and the neck of the fan. Ah, there we go. A little wiggle jiggle. There it is. Fan off. And the pulley will slide off right after it. Put your bolts somewhere that you can keep up with them, or put them back where they came from. Now, I think, and I'm probably wrong, but there's only 3 bolts holding on this AC and power steering pump bracket. 9/16, and you're going to need a deep one for that. And then there will be more when it doesn't come off and I have to figure out where those are at. I was right. There was 4. It was right there, you know, beside the others. Now I think, hopefully, I can just slide that off and set it to the side. And then it'll be in the way if we have to get in there and actually take the timing cover off. I guess now I'm just going to crack that water pump off. This too uses many different bolts. Going to be bigger than a 9/16, probably a 5/8. And they are very different depending on where they're at. So you want to make sure when you take stuff like this apart, if you don't know where it goes back together by memory, because you're an experienced Ford mechanic, then you want to lay them out so you know which is which when you go to put it back. See what I mean? Now I started at the 12 o'clock position and went clockwise as I took them out. So I just, I know that that one goes in at 12 o'clock, and then that one's next, and that one, that one, that one, that one. And I think that's all that's on there. Nope, there's something else. Always something else. Yeah, there we go. Get out of there, you. Alright, well, normally you'd take your hoses off first. I didn't, and I will now. Alright, ignore the mess of projects past. After many aggressive actions towards the heater hoses and the lower radiator hose, water pump is off, and you'll see that this gasket seems to be in pretty good shape. A little bit of bloating right here and a little torn right here, but that's probably from taking it off. The area that I was seeing coolant coming out of was on the top side anyway, which would have been from this area. And that looks good. And of course, don't be a dummy. They're here. Look at them. Make sure it wasn't one of these hoses. I looked at these pretty good. Didn't see any signs of what could have been a leak from them. Sometimes you'll see cracks or holes in them, or you'll see where coolant had come out of them and then dried off and there'd be residue on the outside of the hose. None of that. So we're going deeper. Well, we now reach the portion where I start yelling at engineers. The thermostat housing needs to come off. That bolt's fine. This bolt, you can't get a socket on it because the timing cover housing and my ratcheting wrench is too fat to fit here, so I can only fit a regular wrench on there. And that's got to come off because these bolts back here that I'm only going to be able to fit a wrench on. This can't be easy, can it? That's not the name of the channel. Why? 4 9/16 bolts hold that crank pulley on. An impact helps with that because your ratchet just wants to spin the engine. Now I got to get that big bolt out so we can pull that balancer off. A 15/16 socket will get your crank bolt out. Surprisingly enough, my 3H drive 20 volt DeWalt zipped it right out of there. Now we need a puller. It's the next morning. I had some other things to do. Doing this out here was a choice, wasn't it? Alright, I've got my harmonic balancer puller here. This is going to be real simple. You take this thing, slide it into this thing so that it's this way. Then you take this thing, see that? It's all rounded off on the end. That's the adapter. That's going to stick off in the hole that your crank bolt goes in. Thread that in there. Now, I'll take, in our case, a couple of these 3/8 by 16 bolts, thread that in where the crankshaft pulley went into the harmonic balancer. Then I will just spin this bad boy right here. It will push forward and this will pull the balancer off. Now, I'm going to use an impact because why not? And I will use a crescent wrench to hold the big part of that piece on there and spin her forward. There we go. From the looks of it, this needed some attention. All right, we got a bolt up here, a couple of bolts down there, the timing pointer, a couple more bolts, and then a couple of bolts that look like they come through the oil pan. All right, a little bit of an update. I did have to slide the old alternator and air pump bracket out of the way because the air pump has got a bracket on the back of it that bolts onto this stud down here at the timing pointer, and it is easier to do that than it is to crawl under the truck and try to take the back of that bracket off. But 3 bolts gets that out of the way. No need for full disassembly. Okay, all the hardware's out, including those 2 bolts that come in from the bottom of the oil pan. Now let's see if we can just wiggle and jiggle this thing off here. Oh, it's tight. Okay. Oh, there's 2 more bolts on the oil pan. Ah, there it goes. Come on. Come on. There's a whole lot of sealant down there on the bottom of this thing at the pan. Oh, there we go. Alrighty, there's our timing cover all off the engine. This is the area I suspected it was leaking from, but I don't know for sure. You can see there's no gasket there. That could have come off while I was pulling it apart, or by the fact that I stuck my little pry bar in right where I thought it was leaking from. Either way, we're going to get this all sealed up, put back together. But in the meantime, I want to play a game. It's called While You're Here. You see, we need a new timing cover gasket set. That's going to come with a gasket for the timing cover, and then it's going to come with gaskets for the water pump. That's great. It'll also come with a new front main seal, which I'm cool with that because it looked like it was leaking some oil, and it'll come with new gaskets to go along the oil pan side. That's fine. But you see, we're into this thing. We got the whole front of the engine off, right? So while you're here, this thermostat, it worked just fine. But while you're here, these rubber heater hoses, they, you know, they're not leaking, they're not damaged, but they are a little old and soft. And once everything's put back together, they're pretty difficult to get to. So while you're here, now these upper and lower radiator hoses, they're a little bit easier to deal with. They cost a little bit more money. I'm gonna leave those alone. They don't swell up when it's running, so they'll be fine. But we dig a little bit deeper into this thing. That timing chain is stretched like Elton. So while you're here, yeah, well, I can see the dollar bills getting little wings. I was going to try to get this fixed today. You know, parts for this thing are stupid cheap, except for those little molded hoses that go into the water pump. At the local parts store, those 2 hoses would have cost me over $70. Since I don't need this truck today, I can wait. So Rock Auto it is. I got everything that I wanted to get for $98 after shipping. Timing chain and gears, timing cover gaskets and water pump gaskets, thermostat gaskets, those little molded heater hoses, and 6 foot of heater hose to run up to the firewall. All that's on the way. The only problem is I've got to wait 5 days for it to get here. Very well. Parts are here. Unfortunately, that's about as far as they'll go by themselves. So let's pick up where we left off. This timing chain and the timing gears are still on the engine. We need to get those off there to make way for the new stuff. All right, so before you take your timing chain set off, you want to have the motor at top dead center on the #1 cylinder on the compression stroke. Okay, or you don't have to. You see the crank pulley or the crank chain, crank pulley, it only goes on one way, so you're going to get that right. But there is the opportunity to mess around and get the cam to move a little bit when you're trying to take that gear off and put the new one on. So to make sure that we get it back on there the way that it was, I'm just going to find my timing mark and use this industrial paint marker to mark a spot on the block so that I know that I've got it lined up and it's not a tooth off. I think this is the kind of stuff that Reagan tried to put regulations on in the 80s. All right, you'll notice that I stuck a rag in the oil pan here. That's so debris doesn't fall down in there and get, you know, in the pan where you don't want it. Now that I've got this bolt out, 9/16, if you use an impact, odds are you won't turn this and everything will still be lined up. We could just kind of wiggle jiggle that off, maybe. I don't know. Come on out of there, you. My extended wiggle jiggle. Come on. This one will move. Look at that. Why won't you? There we go. Little combo wiggle and jiggle. Nuts off. And now that's off. New cam gear. Now remember, we don't want to get this to move. Where's that key at? There we go. Oh, come back. See, there's that timing mark. I want to get that lined up with my white dot down there on the front of the engine. You get the cam off a tooth, you're going to have a bad time. And usually with a new chain, it's a little tight to get everything to just go right on. But a little patience, a little more wear and tear on my lower back from leaning over this truck. We'll get it right where it needs to be. Pull that bottom pulley out a little bit, gives me a little straighter angle at the camshaft. Man, I wish I could afford to buy a new camshaft right now. I mean, we're there. It's only a few more steps. All right, it's where it needs to be. It just needs to be further in. This little offset washer here, it's got a hook that goes into this dowel hole here. I would not suggest driving this home with an impact because, you know, you could mar some stuff up. Here I am, look at me. Little tappa. Just get her home. Put some torques on that. I think good and tight is good enough. There we go. New timing chain installed. Now we're ready to clean up that timing cover and get it in there. All right, here we've got the timing cover all cleaned up on the gasket surfaces. Scraped it off with a razor blade. Be careful, don't want to gouge the metal, right? And then I'm fortunate enough to have a bench grinder over there with the wire brush on it, so I use that to clean up any of the excess stuff that the razor blade didn't get. You don't have that, you can use one of the ones that goes on the drill. And if you don't have that, well, just do the best you can. Make sure you got this stuff clean though, because you don't want to put it all back together, go back over to Steve's house and he'd be like, hey, I smell coolant. And you'd be like, nah. So, one last thing to do before we put this on is it's got the front main seal on it. How you get this out of here doesn't really matter as long as you don't tear up the hole that it goes in. So I'm just going to knock it loose with this screwdriver and hammer. Man, you'd think that thing's been in there for 30 years. There we go. Now we'll get that cleaned up and we'll be ready to put the new one in. Okay, now with that as clean as it's going to be, we'll take our new one here and just set it in there the best we can. Don't grease it or oil it. It's press fit. You don't want anything between it. Then we'll switch out our screwdriver for this block of wood off the floor, set it on there, and we'll just massage it in there. Yep. A little lower. You want it to be flush all the way around. That'll do. It's in there. Now we can put the gaskets on. Okay, and with that timing cover all cleaned up now, ready to put the gasket on. Now instead of just slapping this gasket on there and slapping it on the engine, you got oil and coolant that swirl around in these areas here. So you want to put some sealant on it. I'm going to use gray RTV because just like Frank's Red Hot, I put that shit on everything. Now don't get it confused. You don't have to use a ton of this stuff. Just enough. It's like glue, essentially, that can handle high heat and pressure. So, just going to slap it on there, especially around these coolant passages. And this is where your finger painting skills are going to come back into play. Just smear it. If you use too much of this stuff, well, it'll get into the oiling system and, you know, it'll squish out and then it'll, you know, eventually it can break off and get down in there, clog up your pickup screen, on your oil pump, and that would be bad. Now we'll bring over the timing cover, slap that thing on there, make sure everything's lined up. Once you got everything lined up, just kind of go around slowly, gently, press it into place, make sure all your holes are lined up. And then we can let that set there for a little bit and get tacky, real good and tacky, before we take it over to the engine and try to slap it on there. That way we don't have to worry about it getting out of position while we're trying to tighten it back up. I'll do the same thing with these gaskets that go down here on top of the oil pan and that front seal there. Now when you put on this front oil pan seal, you can put too much on there. You know, you don't have to glob it on. I'm gonna put some on the inside here. The important thing is that you put a good glob in each of these corners where these multi-piece gaskets come together, because that is the most prone area for oil leaks on your oil pan. Now that ought to do. Get in there, you. Make sure that thing sits well in that channel, isn't too far one way or the other, it's bulging out or anything. And you can see here that when you went in there, these little things got tabs on them, right? They should be, you know, not interfering. It squished that out. So now we'll let all this sit here, get a little bit more tacky, and then we'll take it over to the truck after we put a little bit more on the other sides of these gaskets, and then we can attach it to the front of the engine and be done with it. All right, I got my rags out, but always double check, make sure nothing fell down in there. Got everything as clean as I'm gonna get it. Make sure that, you know, you got the big stuff off. And when you get down here in these corners, just like we did with that gasket that goes around the bottom there, make sure we put a good bit of silicone where these two gasket surfaces will meet. Put a little more on there and we're ready to go. All right, so before we go stab it on the car, take some fresh oil, put it on the ring for your front main seal. That way it doesn't get snagged or torn or anything like that and slides over the crankshaft like you want it to. And we'll take it over there and jam it on the front of the truck. Remember that some of these bolts go into coolant passages. So if they had silicone on them, well, they're going to need some more. All right, here we go. Hopefully this is a one and done deal. As long as nothing moves around on me. Well, what's the hold up, Bill? Come on. Crap baskets. So my gasket's trying to come off my cover while I set it in place. Thank you. Gotta get it on these little dowels down here. These top bolts in to hold it in place. Does not want to go on those dowels on the bottom. Probably shouldn't do this. Okay, got a couple of bolts in. Now I just got to go around this thing and wrestle it into alignment, make sure all the gaskets don't move, and get the rest of the bolts in it. Yay! Alright, so after a lot of wiggling and jiggling and moving stuff around and holding my tongue and thinking a lot of negative thoughts about Ford engineers, I got that timing cover on. So before we go slapping the water pump on, it's time to put the harmonic balancer back on. There's a few ways to do this. I've done them all. Alright? You could put this on there and smack it with a block of wood and a hammer. It'll work, but I wouldn't suggest it. There's something on there on the crankshaft. It's called a thrust bearing. Doesn't like that. You could also take the bolt, stick it in there, and just... But what happens when you do that? What happens when you strip those threads? Either on the bolt or, even worse, in the crank. You're having a real bad day. Since I've got my harmonic balancer puller, I'll use it. I'm just going to drive it back on there with it. But, you know, do what you got to do. Also, just like with the seal, on the snout of the harmonic balancer where it goes into the seal, I put a bunch of fresh oil. Alright, got the harmonic balancer all ready to go. Time to put on that water pump, but unfortunately, I've got something else I've got to go and do. So, you know, we'll pick this up later. I'm back. Ready to put this water pump back on, but before I do, this water pump is like an ogre, which is like an onion. It has layers. This plate gets sandwiched between the pump and the timing cover over there. So I've taken it apart, cleaned off all the gasket material. It just looks the way it does because it does, because what it is. Okay? So, now that I've got that cleaned up, put some more RTV gray on this. Nope, not that one. On this one, sandwich them back together and go put it on the truck. Alright, and with that sandwich plate back on and the new gasket with a nice dressing of silicone on it, we're ready to slide back over the truck, put the water pump back on it. Doing this outside, well, that was a choice, wasn't it? Now it's dark. But you know what? While I'm here, I'm going to let my brain squirrel for a little bit. You see that light right there? That old yellow incandescent bulb? It could be better, you know? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it with one of these LED lights from Auxito. These are a premium LED light upgrade for your car. They make bulbs for everywhere that you could think to put a bulb in your car, including this old under the hood light. And it's going to be a lot brighter and last a lot longer than this old bulb. And if you want to get some for yourself, if you go to the link in the description below and at checkout use the coupon code HARDWAY, you can get yourself some for 15% off of the regular price. So go do that after the video. Ooh, that's hot. See, look at that bulb. It's kind of hard to see in the dark out here, but that thing is going to be bright. Watch. Whew. That's so bright it's almost annoying. But I can see anything under the hood of this truck now. Go get you some. Alright, now I'm ready to just slip this water pump down there. This is the part where, you know, I said lay out the bolts so you know what's what. That's important. And remember, just like with the timing cover, some of these bolts, they had silicone on them when you took them out. Should probably have some silicone on them when they go back in. Once you've got all your bolts back in place, you want to go around this thing in a crisscross pattern and tighten them down so you apply even torque around the outside of it. So now that I've got the water pump in place, I went on ahead and slid the lower radiator hose on and just propped up the bracket for the AC compressor and power steering pump over here. Now, heater hoses will need to be changed out while I've got access to them. Put the thermostat on and then we can slide that bracket back up on there. But for now, there's supposed to be a couple of guys punching each other on the TV tonight, so I'm going to go see what that's about. Well, that was pretty uneventful and rather disappointing. I'm going to put this crank pulley back on now. I reckon that I should have put the thermostat on before the timing cover. Crank pulley, check. AC and power steering pump bracket all bolted up, check. Thermostat, check. Now, these heater hoses, pretty cut and dry. Just take one off at a time. Measure the same length on my new hose, cut it, screw it back on. So here I am, I'm right back at it again. Got all my new heater hoses installed. They're all where they ought to be and out of the way and not bound up anywhere. And I've loosely thrown the alternator and smog pump assembly back up into place. Now 3 bolts to attach it to the cylinder head. Then we can put the, actually I could probably go ahead and put this upper radiator hose on. And then we can put the fan pulley and clutch assembly back on the belt. And then it's ready to fire up, maybe. It's going to be pretty cool once I get this fan on. Ta-da! We've taken care of all the hardware stuff. It's all put back together. Now we just got to take care of the software. But we need to consider one more thing. Now we know that coolant passes through the water pump, through the timing cover, and into the engine block. And there's seals there that separate all that stuff. And we acknowledge that when we take that timing cover off, there's a huge gaping hole left open in the top of the oil pan. Well, what happens when you remove something that has coolant in it, sealed up? It leaks and it goes down, right? So odds are if your engine had a bunch of coolant in it, it's now in the oil pan. You're going to need to drop your oil. Fortunately for me, that thing had leaked most of it out. I didn't really see anything fall down, but I don't want to take that chance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this oil out, put some new oil in it, and if there's not water in this oil, well, it's only got like 5 miles on it since like the last oil change. I can't believe that. So if it's still good oil and no water in it, I'll put it in my 240SX. Well, unfortunately, when I cracked the drain plug, the first bit of stuff that came out of there was green. But it's okay. I'm glad that I did that rather than sending coolant through my oiling system. Now, if you haven't gotten yourself one of these, you need to. It's well worth it. If you get them at the parts store, they're pretty pricey. I think they were like 90 bucks at one of the auto parts stores I walked into. I got this one at Harbor Freight for half that, 45 bucks, which is still quite a bit, but again, well worth it. It comes with all these little adapters, fits into whatever car you need to put coolant in.
Hey Dad, how's your video?
It seals up the top of the radiator. It allows you to pour the coolant in above the radiator cap so that you can burp it and get the air out of the system. And then once you're done, you got all the air out. You can, if there's still anything left in this funnel, you stick this little thing in the middle and it seals it up. You take it off, put your radiator cap back on, and you're ready to go. Blub, 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 blub. I get the feeling I don't have enough coolant. Shit. Don't waste your money on that pre-mix stuff. Buy the concentrate. Just make sure that you actually mix it 50-50. I like to use this pitcher. There we go. All that air escaping out of the system as the coolant takes its place. Keep filling it up until you just start getting little slight bubbles like that. Sometimes a good little squeeze of the hoses, force a little more air out of it. And now that it's stopped bubbling, we're not done. Now we're ready to start the truck. And as the truck gets warm and the thermostat opens and coolant starts to flow through the engine, it should pull this down, pump some more air out of the system, and get nothing but coolant in there. So here we go, first fire up. The timing's still good. Definitely want to keep a close eye on every surface we just had apart for the next several minutes to make sure that nothing's leaking. Alright, the thermostat just opened, but before it did, that jug over there filled all the way up and spilled out. And then it opened and then it sucked it all back in. So we got to put some more coolant in it. You know your thermostat's open by the upper radiator hose. So if the engine's sitting here running, you touch that upper radiator hose, it's cold, then the thermostat hadn't opened. And if you're touching it, and all of a sudden you feel it start to get warm or start chugging through, you know the thermostat's open and it's working. All right, I've had this thing running for a while, cycling. Haven't seen any fluctuations in this coolant level in a bit. So I'll stick this little thing in here. Pop the cap off. Put my cap back on. There we go. It should start to pressurize now, and we'll continue to look for leaks. See, when that thing's on there, it doesn't pressurize because there's no cap to hold in the pressure. The pressure is allowed to be relieved into that funnel. Now, you take this off, it's gonna, hot out. Well, everything seems to be working like it should. If there's any residual air in the system now, as the engine gets driven and cooled down and driven and cooled down, the reservoir over here will take care of that. The air will come into the air and it'll suck it out. It'll drain this down when it gets cold. So everything should work out as long as there's no leaks. We're gonna file this under rather annoying because I would have rather spent my time and money doing other things to this truck than this, but it came as a necessity now, didn't it? Well, sometimes it's the way things go, but don't worry, we're not done with this truck. Still a few rough edges to be smoothed over. Don't forget, sometimes guys, you gotta do things the hard way.